On the afternoon of the 26th of December 1900, a small ship was making its way towards a remote cluster of bleak rocks known as the Flannan Isles in the Outer Hebrides. Captain James Harvey planned to land a replacement for one of the 3 men stationed at the Flannan Lighthouse. But as the ship neared the landing stage, Harvey was surprised to see no one there to welcome him. He blew the ship's whistle and fired a distress flare high into the sky, hoping to attract attention. There was no response. Meanwhile, Joseph Moore, the relief keeper, rowed ashore and scrambled up the steep steps which wound their way to the lighthouse at the top of the cliff. When he opened the door, Moore realized at once that something was terribly wrong. He made his way to the kitchen. There he found that the clock had stopped, and one of the chairs was overturned on the floor, as if someone had got up in a great hurry. The remains of a half-eaten meal lay on the table, and the ashes in the fire grate were cold. None of the beds looked as if they'd been slept in. Moore then frantically searched the rest of the lighthouse, but there was no sign of the 3 keepers. They had completely vanished. The Flannan Lighthouse was built between 1896 and 1899 at a cost of just under £7,000 by David Stevenson, a relative of the famous writer Robert Louis Stevenson. Designed to withstand high seas and gale-force winds, the lighthouse was seemingly impervious to anything the elements could throw against it. 75 feet high, it stood at the top of a 150-foot cliff. Generating 100,000 candle power, it flashed twice every 30 seconds and could be seen for 20 miles in every direction. It was owned by the Northern Lighthouse Board in Edinburgh, which by the end of the 19th century operated more than 80 lighthouses in Scotland and the neighbouring islands, employing 600 men. Flannan Lighthouse is based on Eilean Moor in the North Atlantic, the largest of 7 rocky islands making up the Flannans, known to generations of seafarers as the 7 Hunters. It lies 18 miles off Lewis in the Outer Hebrides, and about 65 miles from the northwest coast of Scotland. Until the lighthouse was built, a great many merchant ships and fishing boats had foundered in the treacherous seas around the Flannans. The only other structures on Eilean Moor are the remains of a small stone chapel and several ancient dwellings. The chapel was built by Flannan, a 6th century Irish bishop. Believed to have brought good fortune to everyone he touched, Flannan was later dubbed a saint, and the islands were named in his honour. Shepherds had once brought sheep over from other Hebridean islands to graze on Eilean Moor's rich turf. But because the island was said to be haunted by sea spirits and maybe even St. Flannan himself, none of the shepherds ever spent the night there. Apart from the lighthouse keepers on Eilean Moor, the islands were deserted. It was a lonely and isolated existence, but there was never any shortage of men wanting to work there. Their duties were not particularly onerous. Working in 2-week shifts, they had to keep the light and the mechanical parts in good working order and polish the lenses every day, maintain the lighthouse buildings, and make sure their living quarters were always clean and tidy. At the time, there was no radio contact between the Flannans and the Isle of Lewis. Gamekeeper Roderick Mackenzie was paid £8 a year to watch the light from the mainland. If the light failed, he was to report it immediately to the Northern Lighthouse Board's headquarters in Edinburgh. Since the Flannan Lighthouse had first become operational in December 1899, Mackenzie had never felt the need to make such a report. On the 15th of December 1900, the SS Archtor, an American tramp steamer, was making her way from Philadelphia to the port of Leith near Edinburgh. As he sailed past the Flannans just before midnight, Captain Holman made out the dark, brooding mass of Eileen Moore. But much to his consternation, he did not see the light flashing. The Archtor arrived at Leith 3 days later, and Holman immediately reported the matter to the port authorities. But the information was not passed on to the Northern Lighthouse Board. Robert Mackenzie also failed to report there was something amiss. At Christmas, Flannan was manned by 3 men: James Ducat, Thomas Marshall, the second assistant, and Donald MacArthur, an occasional keeper, who was standing in for William Ross, the first assistant, who was on sick leave. One of the keepers was to be replaced by Joseph Moore. He'd been waiting for the weather to improve, staring anxiously across the sea towards Eileen Moore, where no light could be seen emanating from the tower. On the 26th of December, Moore was finally able to leave Lewis and begin his 18-mile voyage out to the island. As the ship approached the rocky island, Moore felt a deep sense of foreboding. Could something terrible have happened to the 3 keepers? By the 26th of December 1900, the Flannan lights had not been seen for 11 days, but the seas had been too rough for any ship to approach the remote rocky outcrop. When the weather abated, the Northern Lighthouse Board steamer, the Hesperus, began making steady progress towards the Flannans. Like everyone else, Captain James Harvey was extremely worried about the 3 keepers. As the ship neared the island, no one was to be seen on the small landing stage. Hoping to attract attention, Harvey blasted the ship's whistle several times and fired a flare into the sky. Joseph Moore, who was due to replace one of the 3 keepers, then rowed ashore in a small boat. He landed and ran up the steps to the lighthouse as fast as he could, frantically calling out their names. There was no response. All he could hear was the eerie cries of wheeling birds and the sound of the waves crashing against the rocks. As he neared the tower, Moore feared the worst. Finding the door unlocked, he went straight for the kitchen, the usual hub of any domestic activity. He was confronted with the remains of a half-eaten meal, a clock that had stopped, and an overturned chair. None of the beds had been slept in. Moore then ran through the entire building from top to bottom. But no matter how hard he searched, the only sign of life he could find was a half-starved canary in its cage. The light mechanism appeared to be in proper working order. Moore was then joined by men from the Hesperus. They all combed the small island from end to end. But there was still no trace of the 3 keepers. Captain Harvey dispatched a telegram to the Northern Lighthouse Board headquarters, reporting the mystery. A few days later, Robert Muirhead, the board superintendent, who'd appointed the three men and knew them personally, arrived at Flannan to investigate further. He said at the time, "I have the melancholy recollection that I was the last person to shake hands with them and bid them adieu." Muirhead carefully